There was a different kind of tension in the Congress chamber that day. Donald Trump, as former president, was invited to give a special address to Congress, and everyone hoped this would be a peaceful speech. But in the seat where Jasmine Crockett sat, the folder she held contained anything but peaceful things. When Trump began to speak, the chamber was silent. Until at one point, Crockett stood up. At that moment, no one knew that one of the most unforgettable moments of Trump's life was about to unfold. The House chamber on that crisp October morning was filled with an electricity that hadn't been felt since January 6th. After months of negotiations, political maneuvering, and intense media scrutiny, Congress had extended a formal invitation to former President Donald Trump to address a joint session on national unity and moving forward. It was supposed to be ceremonial, diplomatic, a gesture of healing for a divided nation. Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas sat in the third row, her navy blazer pressed, her expression neutral, but her mind racing. The manila folder on her lap was thick with documents, research, and questions that had kept her up for the past 3 nights. Around her, members of Congress filed in with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Some Democrats had boycotted the session entirely, calling it a platform for election lies. Some Republicans treated it like a victory lap. Most everyone else just hoped to get through it without incident. But Crockett had different plans. As a former prosecutor, she had spent her career building cases, gathering evidence, and waiting for the right moment to present irrefutable truth. Today felt like one of those moments. The gallery was packed with media, foreign dignitaries, and carefully screened guests. Security was unprecedented. Secret Service agents positioned throughout the chamber, metal detectors at every entrance, and a tension so thick you could almost taste it. At 11 a.m. sharp, the Sergeant-at-Arms announced, "Mr. Speaker, the former President of the United States." Donald Trump entered the chamber to a mixture of applause and silence. He looked confident, almost defiant as he made his way down the aisle. Some Republicans stood and applauded enthusiastically. Most Democrats remained seated. A few looked away entirely. Crockett watched every step, every gesture, every expression. This was the man who had dominated American politics for 8 years, who had challenged election results, who had inspired both fierce loyalty and profound opposition. And today, he was walking into her house. Trump reached the podium and adjusted the microphone with the familiarity of someone who had commanded this stage before. The chamber gradually quieted as he prepared to speak. "Speaker Johnson, Leader Schumer, members of Congress," Trump began, his voice carrying the authority that had made him one of the most recognizable figures in the world. "I stand before you today with a message of unity, of moving forward, of putting America first." Crockett's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She had heard variations of this speech before, and she knew where it was heading. "We live in challenging times," Trump continued, warming to his familiar rhythm. "Our country faces threats from abroad and division at home. But I believe, and I've always believed, that America's best days are ahead of us." The speech proceeded predictably for the first 10 minutes. Platitudes about American greatness, references to economic achievements during his presidency, calls for bipartisan cooperation that rang hollow given the source. But then Trump's tone shifted. "Now, I know there are some in this chamber who have spread false narratives about the 2020 election," he said, his voice taking on an edge. "Some who have refused to acknowledge the irregularities, the questions that millions of Americans still have about what really happened." A murmur went through the Democratic side of the chamber. This was exactly what they had feared. Trump using this platform to relitigate his election claims. Crockett felt her heart rate increase. This was it. This was the moment she had prepared for. "But I'm here today to say that we must move beyond these divisive investigations and politically motivated prosecutions," Trump continued, his voice growing stronger. "Some prosecutors, and I won't name names, have weaponized the justice system for political gain." Crockett's folder seemed to grow heavier in her lap. She knew Trump wasn't naming names, but the implication was clear. The multiple criminal cases against him, the various prosecutors who had brought charges, he was painting them all as political persecutors. "These witch hunts have divided our country. and distracted us from the real issues facing American families, Trump said, looking directly at the Democratic side of the chamber. It's time to end this weaponization and return to the principles that make America great. That was enough. Crockett stood up. The movement was sudden enough that several members around her turned to look. Trump, mid-sentence, paused and squinted in her direction. "Point of order," Crockett called out, her voice cutting through the chamber like a blade. The silence that followed was deafening. In the 230-year history of Congress, interrupting a presidential address, even by a former president, was virtually unprecedented. Members could be seen looking at each other with expressions ranging from shock to horror to barely contained excitement. Speaker Mike Johnson, caught completely off guard, fumbled with his gavel. The gentlewoman from Texas." "Thank you, Mr. Speaker," Crockett said, her voice steady and clear. She had practiced this moment in her mind dozens of times. "I rise on a point of personal privilege." Trump stood at the podium, clearly uncertain how to proceed. He looked to Speaker Johnson, then back at Crockett, his expression a mixture of surprise and irritation. "The former president just spoke about weaponized prosecutions and political witch hunts," Crockett continued, still standing at her seat, but now commanding the attention of everyone in the chamber. "I think the American people deserve to hear some facts about these so-called witch hunts." "The gentlewoman is out of order," shouted Representative Jim Jordan from the Republican side. "Actually," Crockett replied, never losing her composure, "under House Rule 17, any member may rise to a question of personal privilege when their character or motives have been impugned." She opened her folder and pulled out a document. "Mr. Speaker, the former president just characterized prosecutors as politically motivated. As a former prosecutor myself, I take that as a direct attack on my character and the character of prosecutors across this country." Speaker Johnson looked like he wanted to crawl under his desk. This was uncharted territory, and every word was being broadcast live to millions of Americans. Trump stepped closer to the microphone. "Perhaps the Congresswoman should wait her turn," he said, his voice carrying the dismissive tone that had infuriated opponents for years. Crockett looked directly at him. "Mr. Trump, you've had your turn for the past 10 minutes. Now it's time for some facts." The chamber erupted. Republicans shouted for order. Democrats seemed caught between horror and admiration. Gallery members craned their necks to get a better view of this unprecedented confrontation. But Crockett wasn't finished. "The former president spoke about irregularities in the 2020 election," she said, her voice somehow cutting through the noise. "Let me share some actual irregularities." She held up another document. "In Georgia, the former president called the Secretary of State and asked him to find exactly 11,180 votes, one more than needed to change the outcome. That conversation was recorded." "That's a lie," Trump shot back, abandoning any pretense of presidential dignity. "It's not a lie, Mr. Trump, it's evidence. Evidence that resulted in criminal charges." Crockett's prosecutorial training was on full display, calm, methodical, devastating. Speaker Johnson was banging his gavel frantically. "The House will be in order. The gentlewoman will take her seat." But Crockett pressed on. "The former president spoke about weaponized justice. Let me tell you about weaponized justice. Weaponized justice is calling election officials and threatening them if they don't change vote totals. Weaponized justice is pressuring the Department of Justice to declare an election corrupt without evidence. Weaponized justice is telling supporters to march to the Capitol and fight like hell." The chamber was in chaos now. Some Republicans were walking out in protest. Some Democrats were on their feet applauding. Security agents were positioning themselves strategically throughout the room. Trump gripped the podium, his face reddening. "This is exactly the kind of partisan attack that's dividing our country." Crockett took a step into the aisle, still holding her documents. "No, Mr. Trump. What's dividing our country is leaders who refuse to accept the truth. What's dividing our country is calling prosecutors corrupt for doing their jobs. What's dividing our country is standing in the chamber where our democracy was attacked and pretending it was just another tourist visit." "I never said that," Trump protested. "You didn't have to say it," Crockett replied. Your supporters said it for you. And when they were arrested, when they were prosecuted, when they were convicted by juries of their peers, you called them political prisoners. You're still calling them political prisoners. She held up another document. This is a list of the 880 people who have been charged in connection with January 6th. 880 Americans who believed your claims about a stolen election. 880 people whose lives have been destroyed because they believed your lies. The word lies hung in the air like smoke. No one in the chamber had expected this level of direct confrontation. Trump stepped away from the podium, clearly agitated. I won't stand here and be lectured by someone who doesn't understand what really happened. I understand perfectly what happened, Crockett shot back. I was here on January 6th. I was in this chamber when we had to evacuate because a mob was trying to stop the certification of a free and fair election. I heard the chants. I saw the weapons. I felt the fear. Her voice grew stronger. And do you know what the most shameful part was? It wasn't the mob outside. It was the members of this chamber who, even after the violence, even after the destruction, even after police officers were injured and people died, still voted to overturn the election results. She gestured toward several Republican members. Some of them are sitting in this room right now, applauding you, pretending that day never happened. Representative Matt Gaetz jumped to his feet. This is a disgrace. The gentlewoman is turning a unity address into a partisan circus. Crockett whirled to face him. Congressman Gaetz, you want to talk about disgrace? The disgrace is that we're giving a platform to someone who tried to overturn a Democratic election. The disgrace is that we're pretending this is about unity when it's really about rehabilitation. She turned back to Trump, who was still standing at the podium but looking increasingly uncomfortable. Mr. Trump, you came here today talking about moving forward. But you can't move forward from something you refuse to acknowledge happened. You can't heal wounds you pretend don't exist. And you can't unify a country when you're still dividing it with the same lies that caused the division in the first place. Speaker Johnson had given up trying to restore order. The chamber was in complete chaos, with members shouting, reporters frantically typing, and security preparing for who knew what. But in the eye of the storm, Crockett continued with prosecutorial precision. You want to talk about weaponized justice? Let me tell you what weaponized justice really looks like. It's a president who uses the pardon power to protect allies who refuse to cooperate with investigations. It's a president who fires FBI directors for investigating his campaign. It's a president who calls prosecutors enemies of the people for following the evidence where it leads. She paused, letting her words sink in. And it's a president who, when he loses an election fair and square, spends months spreading lies about fraud that he knows aren't true, culminating in an attack on the Capitol that resulted in deaths, injuries, and the first non-peaceful transfer of power in American history. Trump had heard enough. This is fake news. Everything she's saying is fake news. It's not fake news, Mr. Trump. It's testimony. It's evidence. It's the sworn statements of your own appointees, your own staff, your own family members. Crockett held up a thick stack of papers. It's the transcripts from the January 6th committee, where witness after witness, Republicans, people who worked for you, people who supported you, testified under oath about what really happened. She began reading from the documents. Quote, the president said something to the effect of, I don't want people to know we lost. This is embarrassing. Figure it out. That's from your own Attorney General, Bill Barr. Trump's face was now visibly red. Barr was a disappointment. He was weak. Quote, I told the president that the allegations of fraud were bullshit. Also Bill Barr, under oath, to Congress. Crockett flipped to another page. Quote, I thought the idea that the election was stolen was crazy stuff. That's from your campaign manager, Bill Stepien. They were all part of the swamp, Trump protested. Quote, we can't make the numbers work. That's from your data analyst explaining why the fraud claims couldn't be substantiated. The methodical presentation was devastating. Each quote, each piece of evidence, each witness statement chipped away at Trump's narrative like a prosecutor building a case before a jury. quote, "It was disappointing that other people were not truthful with the American public." That's from your daughter, Ivanka Trump, talking about your claims of election fraud. The chamber fell silent at that. Even Trump seemed stunned that Crockett would quote his own daughter's testimony against him. "Mr. Trump," Crockett said, closing the folder, "you came here today asking for unity. You asked us to move forward, but unity isn't possible when it's built on lies. Moving forward isn't possible when you refuse to acknowledge where we've been." She took a step closer to the well of the House. "You want unity? Acknowledge that you lost the 2020 election. Acknowledge that your claims of fraud were false. Acknowledge that your actions on January 6th were wrong. Acknowledge that the prosecutors investigating you aren't corrupt. They're doing their jobs." "I will never acknowledge a rigged election," Trump shouted. "Then you will never be a unifying leader," Crockett replied. "Because unity requires truth. And the truth is that you lost. The truth is that your claims of fraud were investigated by your own Justice Department, your own Homeland Security Department, your own appointees, and found to be false. The truth is that over 60 courts, including judges you appointed, rejected your legal challenges." Her voice grew quieter but somehow more powerful. "And the truth is that on January 6th, when you had the power to stop the violence with a simple statement, you chose not to. You watched the violence on television for hours while members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, feared for their lives." She looked around the chamber. "Some of the people in this room that day texted their loved ones goodbye messages because they thought they might die, and you did nothing for hours." The silence that followed was profound. Several members were visibly emotional, remembering that day. Crockett's voice was steady but passionate. "So no, Mr. Trump, I won't sit here quietly while you rewrite history. I won't let you use this chamber to spread the same lies that led to violence, and I won't let you attack prosecutors for doing their jobs while you refuse to take responsibility for yours." She gathered her papers. "Mr. Speaker, I yield back to the former president. Perhaps he'd like to use his remaining time to address the facts I've presented rather than the fiction he's been peddling." As Crockett returned to her seat, the chamber remained in stunned silence. Trump stood at the podium, looking smaller somehow, his prepared remarks seemingly forgotten. For the first time in his political career, Donald Trump appeared to be at a complete loss for words. Speaker Johnson cautiously approached the microphone. The former president may continue his remarks." Trump looked out at the chamber, at the Democrats who were watching him intently, at the Republicans who seemed unsure how to react, at the media recording every moment. He began, then stopped. He looked down at his prepared text, then back up at the audience. "The election was stolen," he said finally, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. Crockett remained seated but raised her hand. "Point of information, Mr. Speaker. The former president just repeated a claim that has been investigated and debunked by his own administration. Are we going to allow this chamber to be used to spread disinformation?" Speaker Johnson looked desperate. This was far beyond anything in the procedural manual. Trump gathered his papers from the podium. "I think I've said what I came to say." "Actually," Crockett called out, still seated, "you came to talk about unity. You haven't addressed that at all. You've just repeated the same divisive claims that got us into this mess." Trump paused at the edge of the platform. For a moment it seemed like he might respond. Then he shook his head and continued walking toward the exit. As he reached the aisle, Crockett stood one more time. "Mr. Trump." He turned. "The invitation to tell the truth is always open. When you're ready to acknowledge what really happened, when you're ready to take responsibility for your actions, when you're ready to truly work toward unity instead of just talking about it, the American people will be listening." Trump stared at her for a long moment, then continued his walk up the aisle and out of the chamber. As the doors closed behind the former president, the chamber erupted in a mixture of applause, shouting, and stunned conversation. Some Republicans were furious about the breach of protocol. Some Democrats were energized by Crockett's courage. Everyone was trying to process what they had just witnessed. Crockett sat down quietly, placing her folder on her lap. Around her, colleagues approached with expressions ranging from admiration to concern. "Jasmine," whispered Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, taking the seat next to her. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen in this chamber, or the most politically suicidal." Crockett smiled for the first time that day. Maybe both. Outside the chamber, Trump faced a wall of reporters. His usual bravado seemed diminished as he fielded questions about the unprecedented confrontation. "Mr. President, how do you respond to Representative Crockett's accusations?" "She's a radical prosecutor who doesn't understand the truth," Trump said, but his voice lacked its usual fire. "Will you be responding to the specific evidence she cited?" "It's all fake news. The whole thing is a witch hunt." But as Trump left the Capitol that day, something had shifted. For the first time, he had been challenged directly, immediately, and with receipts. He had been forced to confront his own words, his own appointees' testimony, and his own record in real time. The confrontation made headlines around the world. Some praised Crockett for her courage in speaking truth to power. Others criticized her for breaking precedent and politicizing what was supposed to be a unity event. But everyone agreed on one thing. American politics had changed that day. The era of allowing lies to go unchallenged, of letting powerful figures rewrite history without pushback, of prioritizing decorum over truth. That era was over. 3 months later, when Trump announced his 2024 presidential campaign, the first attack ad against him featured footage from that October day in Congress. Crockett's words, his stammering responses, his inability to address the facts she presented. The ad ended with a simple question. If he can't handle the truth from one congresswoman, how can he handle being president again? And in Texas's 30th district, Jasmine Crockett's approval ratings reached an all-time high. Not because she had been partisan, but because she had been prepared. Not because she had been loud, but because she had been right. Because sometimes, in the face of powerful lies, the most important thing you can do is stand up and speak the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it breaks precedent, even when the most powerful person in the room doesn't want to hear it. If this story inspired you, if it reminded you that truth is more powerful than politics and courage is more important than comfort, make sure to subscribe for more stories of people who refuse to let lies go unchallenged. Because democracy doesn't protect itself. It requires people brave enough to stand up, speak out, and demand better, even when it's hard, especially when it matters.